So tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, David Karle, who many of you already know quite well. He's very much a local expert in this area. He grew up in Orange County, California. He received his bachelor's degree at UC Davis in wildlife and fisheries biology and a master's degree from CSU Sacramento in recreation and parks administration. He was a ranger in the California state parks for 27 years, including the Mendocino Coast, Hearst Castle, the Auburn State Recreation Area, and the State Indian Museum in Sacramento. From 1982 through 2000 at the Mona Lake Tufa State Reserve, he shared the unit ranger position with his wife, Janet. He taught biology and natural history courses at Cerro Coso Community College in Mammoth Lakes, and he's the author of 15 nonfiction books, 2 novels, and is the president of the Mono Basin Historical Society. And as you might have seen, David has brought several of his books that he's going to be talking about tonight, and I think he's agreed to do some book signing afterwards. If any of you have a book or would like to purchase a book and get it signed by David, it's a great chance to do that tonight. So I'm really pleased that he's going to be here giving us a bit of a history lesson and talking about the life of von Schmidt. So welcome, David.
So, my turn to talk. Can you hear me all right? Way in the back, okay? Oh, needs louder shit, they say. Okay. Right? Does thumbs up mean good? Oh, okay. Thumbs down. Okay, no thumbs down. Thank you. I don't really need these lights if you would like to, if there's a way.
We need them on.
You need them on. Okay, I need those lights. I love coming to a place like this. Thank you, SNARL. Thank you, Valentine. In part because this opportunity to show pictures so big is just so neat, especially when you're showing old sections of maps where the words are really tiny most of the time. So it's wonderful. Great. Okay. So tonight I want to tell you about the life story of Alexei Waldemar von Schmidt, A.W. I refer to him most of the time, and his role in shaping California, in both literally in terms of boundaries and lines that are part of what shapes California, but also he was here from 1849 until 1906, and interesting years in California history in both cases, and he had a lot to do with what went on here. So that's where we're going. The little icons at the bottom are to help make a point I need to make tonight, which is that the book is not just about survey lines on the ground, but it's also about this man's life history. And I went into this trying to find out if there was enough information to write a real biography that would do that. And I think there was. So here we go. So I'm gonna keep that in. That's a relatively new feature I found. You like that? That's the only one in the show. So. Von Schmidt was born in Europe, in Latvia. Today it's Latvia, it was Russia then. And his family came over in 1826, and he grew up, and his father had been a civil engineer in Europe and taught him a lot of things. So when gold was discovered in California in 1848, and the word reached the East, von Schmidt was living in New York, working on some projects for the government. He was 28 years old by then, 27 that year, but 28 when he came out in 1849. And he was one of those first people to get on a ship that was heading from New York around, where'd I put the pointer? Around the Horn there of South America and all the way up. But you'll notice something about his route. He was on this boat called the Pleiades, and it probably should never have left port, it seems like, because by the time they endured all these storms that they had to endure, they had to put into Mazatlan, Mexico, instead of continuing straight to San Francisco, because the boat was just in trouble. And when they got there, the port authorities would not let it continue onward. And there was a bunch of 49ers on board who really wanted to get to California before everybody else, including von Schmidt. So he worked with, there was one other boat or ship in port, and he got on this boat called the Fanny, and they came on up to San Francisco. The other lines that are on here have to do with his brother, his older brother Julius, and his father Peter, who came later. Julius arrived about a month after AW in San Francisco by using the Panama route, which means you come on a ship, get off, and hike or ride mules, and in some cases we're in canoes. Anyway, work your way across the Panama Isthmus and then they got on steamboats and came on up to San Francisco. And then his father came even later that summer. But they were all 49ers. And when they arrived, of course, what really compelled everybody, there were people who came and maybe didn't go searching for gold, but it's pretty clear that von Schmidt did, and that was really what the test of coming to California was mostly about for most of these people. These pictures, by the way, were painted by von Schmidt's grandson, who was a pretty famous, his name's Harold von Schmidt. By 1940s, he was a pretty famous illustrator of books and magazine covers and all. And he did this in 1949 to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 1849 gold rush for a calendar. Anyway, the state parks have them now, and I got to use some in the book, so that's great. So this thing shows the kind of what happened that year and in the next year, especially where ships were coming by the hundreds eventually into San Francisco Bay, and the people and the crews left the ships there and went off to the gold country, almost all of them. And 100,000 ultimately within that first year or so of the gold rush that arrived in California. So von Schmidt, we think, pretty sure he went up to the Feather River because he told his children and grandchildren about the Feather River, one of the particular sites there, showed him a little bag that maybe was used to gather gold, but he didn't find much. The next year he worked on the American River and in a more of a civil engineering way I'll tell you about. So I wanted you to see, before I go too far into this, kind of what he looked like in California. This is A.W. von Schmidt, probably about after 5 or 6 years in California. He's probably in his 30s by this time. And within 2 years, he met and married Fanny. And Fanny's family had been in Mazatlan, and there's some not clear, but there's a probability that he may have met her as a 12-year-old. And then by the time she was just about 17, they got married up in California because that family that had lived in Mazatlan moved up there. So anyway, before leaving New York, back in 1847, up here it says that A.W. and J.H., that's his brother Julius, together patented a number of things, but one of them was this rotary water pump. And as it turns out, you'll see in the story that a lot of the things he got involved with down the line had to do with moving water and using his particular pump to do that. So he's in California. He's worked for a couple years at trying to make some money or to find gold. One of the things he tried to do was use his pump to pump water to serve miners who had dry diggings, but it wasn't cost effective, so that didn't work out too well. But he has this ability and this expertise with steam engines. And so by 1851, as it says here, he was the master of a steamer that looked sort of like these. These are not the one called the Santa Clara, but he was moving, you could go from San Francisco over to Stockton through the delta of the Sacramento and then the San Joaquin River 3 times a week, and then you could come back the next day, and mostly it was an overnight run. Now this is interesting because the next big thing that's coming is, people mostly realize about this man, he was a surveyor. California was on the verge of needing a bunch of surveyors to try to figure out things about land ownership in the state. And one of the likelihoods is that von Schmidt, as the master of going to Stockton, had a meeting with John Charles Fremont and his wife Jessie. Jessie Fremont, Fremont, of course, was an explorer. He became the one of the first two senators for the new state of California. Very important man in the state at this time. And Jessie's books talk about her writing about how they took the steamer, the steamboat, to Stockton, and then they would get on land transportation to come down to try to get to where their rancho was, named Mariposa. It's this gray blob here. All of these blobs show the boundary or the land associated with Spanish and Mexican land grants. And the state and the federal government had to figure out, it actually was part of the Constitution of California, that to guarantee that the owners of those grants would be allowed to keep their land, but they had to prove it was their land, and they had to go through a legal process of analysis that involved hiring their own, they had to pay for it, surveyors to survey their ranchos. And so this became one of the things that von Schmidt did, especially between 1852 and 1859. And then later, mostly it was the other kinds of surveying. So the very first, there's a number here, right there, it says number 1. The very first land grant that was dealt with by the committee that was involved, or commission involved with this, was Fremont's. And von Schmidt did this survey there in Mariposa. So he was going to get to meet and get involved with a number of people who were big names at this time, and because they were big landowners. One of them you may have know about. We have Lassen National Park. We have the up in northern Sacramento River Valley. Peter Lassen had this long stretched out rancho, very valuable because it adjoined the Sacramento River for so far. And see, now that it's big, we can read it. A.W. von Schmidt right there, deputy surveyor. So he was hired to do that one. He was also hired to do John Bidwell's Arroyo Chico Rancho, which is the town, the city of Chico is there now. And this is more prominent. He was getting his name bigger and darker as he went along here. But anyway, he worked on a number of these, and a couple dozen ranchos. But then there was a transition that was going to happen. Oh, I'm going ahead of myself. I wanted to mention John Sutter. Sutter's Mill was where the gold discovery happened in 1848. Sutter had property that would become Sacramento, and his rancho was called New Helvetia. And this portion drawn down here is separate from this portion. This is where Sacramento on the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers is. And then up here on the Sacramento River, it goes up to where the Feather River comes in as a tributary. And the reason I put some of this letter copied from the archives in the Bancroft Library is that some of the wording here is he's basically closing a letter that has been a whole plea. He's basically saying, get this going because so that I have so I know what I can hope. He was pleading. Sutter was in great debt. He had given away more land than he ever owned, and basically he needed to get this resolved so he could, get all the debtors paid off and off his back, and he was proposing going into a wood transport business with von Schmidt also in the letter. So anyway, those guys. So back to this map that I opened with. This white parts of this map, by the way, are white because they were unknown land. They were not surveyed land. The map itself was done after some surveying had occurred between 1852 and at this point, 1858. And a lot of it you can see here. Here's orient you. Here's Monterey Bay and San Francisco Bay. And down in the lower San Joaquin Valley, at that time, the largest lake in California existed, Tulare Lake. It changed. It would go up and down a lot in wet and dry years, but very famous for the wildlife that it had and all when people got in there. And all of these squares are an indication that townships have been surveyed and the corners marked. And when you get other maps that get more detailed, the sections within those townships would have been surveyed too. And these standards, There's 6 of these, so there's 24, wait a minute, 6 times 4, yeah. 24 miles between each standard going south, all beginning from a very important place that von Schmidt was involved with. This is Mount Diablo, which is the initial point that was established, the summit of Mount Diablo, because it overlooked so much of California. And from that, the Mount Diablo baseline would run directly east-west across the state to the California border, which nobody knew where it was at that point. That had to be figured out by surveyors. But first, let's talk about this, because the next slide shows you that in 1853, he went on a survey down to the Tulare Lake region, and he took along a man that a friend that he ran into before he left on this excursion, named Andrew Grayson, who some people have called the Audubon of the West. He was a guy who was really into wildlife, and I think he got better at drawing, because these look pretty primitive. But they were camped on the Kings River Slough. He doesn't say so, but this man is probably von Schmidt because he's so prominent in that picture. And I want to say one more thing about this. Oh yeah, he added another diagram in this report. That's supposed to be a self-portrait, or that's him. That's Grayson with the big belly, and that's probably von Schmidt. I think the best thing about it here as an artist is this stuff right here, some animal, elk that it looks like that was shot. Grayson is interesting in another way. I gave this talk a month ago up at Donner, and Donner Pass, where the Donner Party had their problems and all. Grayson was the leader of the wagon train when it left Independence, Missouri, coming west. These were before Gold Rush. Now this is 1846, and in his party, there was some differences of opinion about which way to go when they got farther west, and the Donner Party split off from his wagon train, and of course that didn't work out well for them at all. So the route that Grayson followed took him up north, up towards Idaho Territory, and then he made his way to California. So interesting connection there, at least for the Donner people. So he's doing a lot of this work that happened in the San Joaquin, and then by 1855, the government, basically these contracted surveyors were working for the federal government as contractors, and the state had an assigned federal survey team that was working in California, this new state. So he was given the contract to extend this very important baseline, the Mount Diablo baseline, which had only come about this far. I think it says Sonora and Chinese Camp right in here, into the foothills. And so that's, if you're going on Highway 120 over the mountain, then you get down into the foothills, you'll pass that. So this was all unknown, and by the time this map was made, of course, it began getting all of these squares, because that's what he's going to do next. Between 1855, 56, and 57, he would make a bunch of trips, but the first job was get the Mount Diablo baseline, a straight line, straight heading east from his origin point. They didn't know much about, until he did this work, about what was going on over there. In 1852, Lieutenant Moore with a bunch of mounted soldiers came from the Mariposa area chasing Chief Tenaya's band of Indians who had been living in Yosemite Valley. Now that battle, that conflict started in 1851, and Tenaya fled out of Yosemite Valley. Moore went after him, trying to find and punish this renegade in their thinking, and he never did find him, but his party went into the Mono Lake Basin and came back. They weren't map makers and they weren't topographer people, they were chasing Indians. They came back saying, oh, we think there's some signs of gold. They had some descriptions and some drawings that just don't look right. That's Mono Lake, and under there, notice here Indian Valley, I think that's a reference to what we now call Yosemite Valley. Those soldiers are the ones that applied the name Yosemite after talking to their guides, the Yokuts, in about that valley. And then this is the great detail of the Sierra Nevada. So he didn't have much to go on. Von Schmidt did not in terms of preparing for this trip. Here's another map a year later, and there's some more names have been placed on the map. They're all people who were soldiers who were part of the party. This would probably be Rush Creek, I guess. Of course, and now there's islands in Mono Lake, but it still doesn't look right. And if you look really close, there it says Yosemite. But I don't even, there's no indication from the next few years of records that von Schmidt even knew that name. It wasn't really widely publicized as Yosemite. It's just beginning to be in those years. Some of the first visitors to the valley came in 1855 when von Schmidt was beginning his trek. So here's the numbers of his first group. On June 5th, 1855, with 12 people, which included 6 of them to take care of the packers, to take care of these 18 mules. They started out, and this is just the first mile. Look at all this up and downing they were doing. So how do I know that? These are references to chains, the surveyor's chains over here. A chain is 66 feet, 80 to a mile. So in the first mile, this is some of the foothills, right? It's up, down, up, down, up, down. This is what they would have to do. Whatever they would find as they went on a straight line across the Sierra Nevada, that would be recorded. And then they would mark the township corners that they encountered. Now, von Schmidt had a little bit of artistry. Some of his brothers, 2 of his brothers were actual artists. And he drew this pencil sketch. It's in the back pages of one of his journal books from all of this surveying. I had been looking at all the entries through going forward through, trying to look for good pithy things. And I finally, on my second or third trip to the Bancroft Library, I flipped to the back, and there was a few pages of just not very completed pencil sketches mostly, but this is in the lower Tuolumne River Canyon, and they encountered, he described this waterfall. They also encountered really, really steep country as the Tuolumne River comes down through the foothills there, and they had to offset to the south, and they would do that several times until they ended up 5 miles south of the survey line through most of what would someday be Yosemite National Park. Now this is, I'm not going to, you don't need to read this. This is, nature notes are still being published in the park, but this is back in 1949 where the author wrote about von Schmidt, and in that he had this map that's really hard to make sense of, but I want to use it in a couple of ways, and I'll show you a clearer map about their route in a moment. So this is that map as they started out in terms of what they knew. Okay, and this is a little bit farther along in terms of what they likely knew. The point is that they basically were making discoveries of what would be over the next hill when they crested that hill. They really didn't have any information. And that, I think, was part of the excitement or the attraction for somebody like von Schmidt. It's clear that there's this job to do, but there's also this exploration and discovery element that's involved. So here's a more familiar looking map of that, and here's the baseline that they needed to document, and they ended up having to travel 5 miles south of there through most of it. That was okay because the ultimate goal was to get back onto the line in the valleys of the east side that were suitable for ranching and farming and homesteading. And the Sierra Nevada itself wasn't considered to be. So traveling through there, keeping track of it and marking it, but it was okay that they didn't mark it right on the line the whole way. And the biggest problem was here, the Tuolumne River Canyon as it came out forced the movements to the south. Just a couple of things here, so I'm going to show you the next pictures. If they had only known more about what was out there, it would have made sense to come up to Tuolumne Meadows and have easier travel, but they didn't. This is the Tioga Road. Here's Yosemite Valley. And on the Tioga Road, you cross Yosemite Creek, which of course comes down and flows over the rim into the valley. And then Olmsted Point, they were just right below there in that country. This was really rugged, and they talked about how it was almost impossible to get along. They were there in June, and there was still snow up in that high Coit country there. So let me just tell you about this story. Lily von Schmidt was von Schmidt's daughter, and she wrote, after he died, actually, a short biography, and she wrote this about how he told them that he thought he might have been the first non-Indian to look over this rim into Yosemite Valley where this waterfall was. He didn't name it Yosemite Falls. It wasn't called that to him, but he told his crew, we're going to stop here for grub, and even though it's only 11 o'clock, I'm going to make a sketch of these beautiful falls. Now, was he the first? There's a lot of debate. There's a legend that Joseph Walker, about a decade earlier, no, 2 decades earlier, had maybe followed a route. He described some country that people have interpreted as looking into Yosemite Valley. But I would point you to Scott Stein's book, Way Across the Mountain, which is a book that basically makes a strong case that Walker was probably never this far south and was working across the Sierra farther north. So maybe it's true. Maybe von Schmidt was right. So, I thank Rick Cattleman sitting over here for this nice photo. They struggled through those high summits towards the crest. They finally got to the crest, and he set a flag on a high mountain peak for triangulation. And what he says next is really one of the reasons I got interested in this man, because I so loved what he said. He says that the view out to the east is magnificent, the most beautiful that I've ever saw. So. Good for you, von Schmidt, I think. So now they had to get down, and they came down over Mono Pass that so many travelers and so many people who lived in the area have always used. And that canyon, many people call it still today Bloody Canyon, and it probably originates with von Schmidt's description because his mule's legs were cut up pretty good by the shale on that and the rock on that route. He didn't call it Bloody Canyon himself, but he certainly described it that way with the mules. So here he is. He comes down. Now he's got to bump back up to get back onto the baseline itself. And this is now in the Mono Lake Basin. Mono Lake doesn't look right yet because he hasn't surveyed it yet, but this was his initial map from doing the baseline. He goes a couple miles, and lo and behold, he's got to bump around the Mono craters. So he gets up and around them and comes back to the line, and then does what he's been hired to do, marking these township corners all the way out here. They didn't know where the boundary was out here, so that was going to come later, and he would be a key figure. But they did tell him to come south. He came straight south for 72 miles. So that gets him into the Owens Valley, and then he was done. He'd accomplished what that contract asked him to do. He'd done all of that in 120 miles in 40 days, and didn't lose anybody. He was told by some local Indians that the best way to go back is not, he was thinking of going Walker Pass to the south, but they told him Sonora would be better. And because he hadn't planned things as well, and after this he planned much better trips, they had some food shortages on the way back over Sonora, and some a little snow to deal with. So. That thinking ahead to just establish some look at what was coming, because the next 2 years he would go all the way down below the Owens Lake, and so it's his first descriptions are in his journals of what he saw there and what he thought of it, and yeah, so this is what happened. He does, what did I say here? 5 more trips between December of that year, 1855, and then late summer of 1857 to accomplish all of this, from above Mono Lake up into Bridgeport Valley, all the way down to about, below Alancha. They were going to do the the flatter lands, the lands that might be suitable for homesteading, and down to sections now. So the big squares we were looking at were townships, but within each township, you've got 6 miles, 6 sections across, each a mile square, and then you drop down and you get 6 more, and you do that 6 times. And so this is up here because it's Mono Lake where I live. My house is right there, but it wasn't then. This is Mill Creek, which was not called Mill Creek then. And this would be what we call DeChambeau Creek now. And if you look real close here, he describes that there was an Indian trail dotted here, running all along. And if you look at the edges of the lake, there are a series of straight lines that approximate the curve of the lake. They're called meanders. And that was, again, part of his contract was to, by the time he finished all of the surveys, to have established meanders on the 2 biggest bodies of water in this area, Mono Lake and Owens Lake. And those became important when the effort to save Mono Lake, and there was a whole big long court cases and hearings about what was Mono Lake like in the past and what's the evidence for that. This ended up being quite accurate and quite helpful to the people involved in that. So lots going on in these next few years as they keep coming back. Oh, I should mention that you may have noted December and might have sort of wondered. They came back over the Sierra in December to do surveys. I looked it up. There was one of the most severe droughts in California history between 1854 and 1859. And it just worked out perfect for them to be able to do more traveling than usual otherwise. This is an interesting news story out of the San Francisco paper, basically debunking or correcting bad information that the von Schmidt party had been massacred by Indians. And can you imagine the poor... Don't forget the family now. He's got, in these years since 1852 when he married Fanny, they've got, in those first years, 1 child and then a second one during the years of these surveys. He would go back home between surveys and then there'd be another baby 9 months later. Yeah. And there were tensions. There were some tensions with the local Indians. Remember that the whole big problem, the massacre in Yosemite Valley, the chasing of Indians over into the east side. The Indians on the east side were, in a lot of ways, protected from a lot of the horrible things that had been already happening with the Indians and the rest of California. But anyway, on August 22nd, 1856, as they were setting up camp in the northern part of Bridgeport Valley, all of a sudden, 30 Indians came walking rapidly in. They were all armed with bows and arrows. Turned out they'd been hunting, but von Schmidt, not knowing for sure what the mood was going to be, had got his group of mules, basically, not wagons, in a circle, and got their arms ready, which consisted of, one of the men was off hunting, so that took their shotgun away. Von Schmidt had lost his revolver. The leader of this group shouldn't do that, but he had. And they had a single-shot rifle. So that's what they had. And so you know what? This was going to be the case for all of his surveys. He needed to get along with the local people. He was not accompanied by soldiers or anything. They didn't go in and ready to fight fights. So he was glad to recognize some of these people who he had seen on the earlier trips. He'd done several by summer 1856. And they traded for half of one of the antelope that they're with us for a saddle blanket. It's a sign of that he needed to actually have that kind of approach to function and do what he needed to do. I think it's a shame that right out here nowadays we can't see this anymore. It used to be a tourist attraction. This geyser going off right over here off the highway where the geothermal plant is now. But when they were there, can you imagine being not knowing what is going to be around the next corner and coming around a hill and seeing this, and this is his description up there, and being, of course, amazed. And he also described this, marsh and steamworks, a hell of a place. Well, that's got to be Hot Creek. Of course, that's my more recent picture. But and he described the mountains off to the west, and he calls them the Organ Pipe Mountains, and I have a feeling that's probably the Minarets, but something like that. So Anyway, give you just a taste of some of the rest of the stuff down going farther south. He actually, there came a time where he had a trusted assistant, and there was a team that worked in 1856, worked from the south, coming over from Walker Pass, coming north, and then he had a team coming down from Sonora Pass to the south. So anyway, in the Owens Valley, one of the important, interesting things that came of his records that kind of got lost for a while, but in 76, Mary D. Decker was one of the authors of this Agriculture Among the Paiute of Owens Valley, and this is taken from their report where they took von Schmidt's drawings, they penciled in where Bishop would be at that point, and then they associated it with these locations with descriptions of that there was irrigated land, irrigated by the Indians, which is very different from the rest of California, except for the Mojave tribe down on the Colorado River. Irrigation practices that could be considered agriculture didn't happen. And so these are some more of von Schmidt's plat maps that are from his records. They would be right in the books, his journal books. And in this case, it's a little different story. They didn't describe these parallel channels that they encountered on these lines that they were running. Remember, they're not really looking at too much at what's going on in the middle of these sections. They're looking at marking, as I said, it's kind of stitching the land and marking these corners. But anyway, where they encountered them, they drew these and labeled them as creeks. And that report makes the correction there that these were running not downhill, but across on the terrain, and that they were signs of irrigation ditches. So that was helpful, and people more recently have gone back and trying to locate some of this stuff that von Schmidt documented. So they finished up in late July. This was within about 2 weeks of their final surveys. This is up east of Mono Lake, and I won't tell you where it is exactly, but because this is one of his survey markers that's really 61 years later, 62 years later, it's really in good shape. And it's because it's in a real hard place for anybody to, why would anybody go to where this one happens to be? You can see the suggestion of the scribing on the posts. So they took posts and they made them four-sided, shaved them so that they would have four sides. One side would be marked with these scribed marks, California, one Nevada. One would tell how far or what the section and range and township numbers were. This one has a 32, I think it is. So it's pretty amazing to come across these. And a lot of them are lost because of development and impacts in areas where really homesteading and ranching in cities did happen. But they're still out there, some to be found. I got to that one with the help of a BLM surveyor who wanted to relocate it, and he was really excited that day. So, 1857, they finished. Von Schmidt moves back to San Francisco, and for the next decade and a half, he basically is focused on the San Francisco Bay Area in a lot of ways. Of course, the early 1860s, 1861 to 65 is the Civil War, and he was an engineer, so he was brought into the California State Militia, laid out a few camps, military camps and things. 1856 overlaps with his surveys on the east side, but during that time, at some point when he was back, he joined up with the Bensley Water Company, the San Francisco Water Company that was capturing water up by San Francisco, just off to the west of the main part of the city. And von Schmidt's expertise was he moved the water in flumes, drilled a tunnel, short tunnel, and then used his pump, a version of his pump to pump the water uphill to 2 reservoirs in San Francisco at the time. He got all that done, and he quit these guys, and he joined up with some other people to do the Spring Valley Waterworks, and they are the ones that thought bigger and farther away. They went down 30 miles on the peninsula to the south, and this is the Pilarcito Creek, became a reservoir when von Schmidt's dam was built there to capture that water. And then they had to move the water, something that had been done in other cities around the world, of course, in ancient history. But he had some tricks that had to be, some things that had to be resolved. The water was moved in flumes. It was moved through a major hillside through a tunnel that was bored. Once it reached close enough to San Francisco, again, it was pumped into a reservoir in the town. And, this was pretty amazing thing. And then once he got all that done for that waterworks, he quit. He wasn't into running day-to-day, stuff. He wanted to do big things and solve big problems. So in 1864, it was the first time he proposed something that he never accomplished, but he kept pushing on it for 35 years, 36 years. His idea, this is a diagram that he made in a plan, was to go up to Tahoe to build a little dam, a 6-foot dam at the outlet of the Truckee River, and then to move that water 130 miles or something like that, whatever it is, across the state, and bring it, across, under the bay, and to bring it to San Francisco, and to along the way serve. At that time, in the 1860s, there was hydraulic mining and this and that going on. So he had this thing that was a good half century too early for most people to even contemplate. The need for it, of course, wasn't there. There's a lot of parallels here with what happened later with water moving out of the Owens Valley and all of the other projects that ultimately this never happened. But I'll show you what the dams look like in a moment, because they came in 1870 and later, and what's there now. But of course, what San Francisco did was, because they didn't do this, they went later in the early 20th century and went after the water from the Tuolumne River in Hetch Hetchy in Yosemite. So he's still doing all these, so that thing becomes a background thing that he wishes he could do and keeps trying to find ways to do it for the rest of his life. 1867-68, San Francisco was the port on the West Coast. It was the most important port. It was where all the shipping would come to, all the steamships and all the stuff that was the gold and now they're beginning to get agriculture stuff to ship. And so a lot of these folks who were the big movers and shakers hired von Schmidt to build them a dry dock. A dry dock is what you do when you bring a ship out of the ocean into a container that you can then pump out the water once you close the gates, leave the boat dry, and repair it and clean it. Did you hear the word pump again? So von Schmidt not only found an innovative way to excavate the rock of this area, which is Hunter's Point, south of the main part of San Francisco, but with explosives, by mining into the rock and laying, this is underwater, by the way, right? So laying explosives in and then detonating to create the basin. But then he has these, in this case, 4 really massive steam pumps that would empty it in a matter of less than an hour and allow the process to go underway. I don't know if he's in that picture. Nobody's ever identified anybody. So we're in the late 1860s, and did you all catch it that just a couple days ago, May 10th, was when the Transcontinental Railroad meeting of the railroad locomotives, the driving of the Golden Spike was happened and was celebrated. On May 9th, San Francisco, a day early, had this gigantic celebration for the Transcontinental Railroad. It was originally supposed to be, the spike was supposed to be driven then. So Governor Stanford, Leland, sends a telegram on May 9th to his brother, AP, and says, it's going to be tomorrow. And they just basically don't tell everybody. There's so much set in motion, an enormous parade. And this guy was the head of the parade, and his chief aide was he was the grand marshal, right, for the parade. Chief aide was A.W. von Schmidt, very famous at this point, engineer and technician in San Francisco. In fact, the paper goes into great detail about all the things, the illuminations and all the things, and it tells us that Grand Marshal Stanford had a yellow banner across his chest, and von Schmidt's was red. And a year later, the thing that made him the most famous of all as an engineer. There was a hazard out just offshore from San Francisco, before you get out to where today Treasure Island is and all. It was this rock that at low tide would be only 5 feet below the surface. And it had needed to be taken care of for shipping. And so the government put out bids, and von Schmidt's bid was $75,000 in cash. He wouldn't be paid anything until he demonstrated that he could do it. By the way, multiply 75,000 by 30. How many? Over 2 million, right? He was going to get paid well for this. And it took him only about a year. And he used many techniques he had demonstrated in the Hunter's Point thing about going down. He built a big thing around this rock and lowered it down in, and then pumped the water out, the ocean water, so it was dry in there, then excavated all over it and placed all these explosives, let all the water back in, and underwater detonation, which was a relatively new thing, backed off with this cord all the way out to a boat, and blew it up. And the people came out to watch this incredible show for them at the time, and that was pretty neat. This is taken on the day of the Blossom Rock explosion. This guy with the X is von Schmidt, A.W. This is his 15-year-old son, Edward. And Edward would be, 17 years old in 2 years, and would be going along on the California-Nevada boundary survey to help. So this was reported. By now, of course, news could get all over the world pretty fast with telegraph in existence. And it was reported, this is a cover of a New York magazine. It was written up in France. It was noted in Australia. And the neat thing, of course, is by now we have photography available. Remember all that photography during the Civil War. So this is the explosion itself, and a couple of the boats that were out there can be seen. So 1870. In 1870, big year for von Schmidt, he bought the land at the Lake Tahoe outlet where the Truckee River flows out at the northwest corner of Lake Tahoe, and he built this 6-foot dam. And his plan was to move right ahead, but he never got funding and authority from all the various powers that be. He tried the state, he tried the city of San Francisco, he tried the federal government, and this is as far as it got for him. He never was able to move ahead. There were competing interests in the railroad along the Truckee River, and so this jump you forward in time. This is what the bridge looks like today. This is an 18-foot bridge, or a dam, I'm sorry, not bridge, built by the Bureau of Reclamation, what would be the Bureau, their first project, the Newlands project, and its purpose was to send the water, control the water that was saved on Tahoe and use it to go serve Nevada. One of the big competition problems for von Schmidt was that Nevada really was objecting that he was going to take water to California, and it was their water. So that's basically what happened with that one. He never did succeed with that. So on to one of the biggest stories of his life, although I think he's already done enough. When the Constitution was made for this new state of California, sitting in Monterey, the guys got the maps out. Fremont had some pretty bad maps, but they used those. The 42-degree north latitude for the north boundary was already established by treaty for the Oregon Territory. So that one, that was a round number for a line. So they decided to go out to the 120-degree longitude, west longitude, and run straight south. And They didn't know that it was going to hit Lake Tahoe. They thought they were going to be east of it. And until they hit the 39-degree latitude and then run an angle down to the 35-degree latitude where it hits the Colorado River. And then the Colorado River would be the boundary down to Mexico. So that all sounded pretty good on paper and relatively easy because they were nice round number latitudes. They weren't half latitudes or fractions or anything. But on the ground, then the surveyor has to figure out what does that mean, really. So here's a map that was rushed into print in 1850, right after statehood. And I'll show you, there's a little dark thing you can see there where Tahoe is or should be. Here's detail of that. So they thought that, for one thing, that Tahoe was all going to be inside California, not cut in half by the boundary. And the name Tahoe is Bonpland. That was Fremont's name for when he came to the lake. He named it after a famous botanist who never came to California, but Fremont admired him. And then it later became named after the governor, Bigler, and then finally we got Tahoe. So they didn't know that. That was one of the reasons why things like that, they had to be resolved. So a government surveyor, Lieutenant Ives, went down to the Colorado River and found out where latitude 35 is. Latitude's pretty easy. It's that angle to the sun, basically, to help you determine your position on the globe. Longitude's different. It involves time, and it's much trickier. So anyway, he established a point that the government would rely on for the next survey's attempts. In 1861, from the Colorado River, this group used some camels. They thought they had enough provisions for 60 days. They thought that water would show itself, and it didn't. And they got in big trouble out in the desert, and they had to escape out through Death Valley, and they almost didn't make it, but they did. They all got out to the Owens Valley eventually. So that didn't succeed, although some people learned. They were watching what had happened and what hadn't happened. So in 1863, there were a couple of things that were really pushing both the California government, the U.S. government, and the Nevada Territory to get this resolved. One was this little war that happened, a 2-day shootout between Sheriff Roop of the Nevada side of the Honey Lake Valley, who he thought he was in Nevada, and he thought they shouldn't have to pay any taxes to California. And the Plumas County Sheriff with some posse came over to enforce the law in Plumas County. There was some shooting, and the Nevada guys were holed up in this little cabin that's now called Roop, or since then it's been called Roop's Fort Defiance. And if you go to Susanville, you can still see it. It's in their city park. Proudly, that's where it was sitting back then, and that became a park for interpreting that. But anyway, nobody knew where the line was there at Honey Lake. Also, as another big problem was here in Mono County, which was a county by 1863. Gold mining had been going on north of Mono Lake in a smaller way, in a pretty big way out in Aurora, and so Aurora became the county seat of Mono County. But everybody knew that somewhere out there was the state line, and they weren't sure. So it needed to be resolved. Eventually, it would be resolved, and Aurora would realize that a survey would confirm that Aurora was 3 miles outside of this boundary line, and Bridgeport would become the county seat. So who confirmed it? A guy, Hooten, was hired by the state of California, and Ives worked. This is a different Ives that did the Colorado River. Worked for the Nevada Territory, and they got a party together. They started up at the Oregon line, came south. By then, there had been another survey determined that, Tahoe is divided by the boundary. So they went out into Tahoe, figured out the angle, aiming for that point down at the Colorado River where they had the coordinates they needed. That's how they determined this angle. And they surveyed down to about here. They got past Aurora. They got east of Mono Lake in the Adobe Valley, and their report is that there were something like 500 Indians there gathered for a pine nut festival. And the Indians really didn't attack them, but they weren't friendly. and there was tension. And so the party of the surveyors, it was October by this time, they just decided to head back to Aurora and started back. And that night, heading back, blizzard came in. Does that ever happen in October? And they weren't ready for that. And like 8 men had bad frostbite. Anyway, so they were done for the season, and they never got funding to come back. Remember, this is now we're several years into the Civil War, and the 2 big issues had been answered. The Honey Lake and the Aurora question. And so the rest of that desert land didn't seem as urgent, and they didn't get the funding to come back. So they didn't. So finally, so that's 18, that's 10 years passed. And in 1872, von Schmidt gets this contract to do the whole thing. And if he gets it done, he'll get $42,000. Multiply by 30, that's over $1 million something. And so this is the cover of the first year's work journal, coming down from Oregon. And up at the Oregon corner, so 3 states corner, Oregon, Nevada, and California, he built a pretty grand marker, which he drew this pencil sketch in his book. And this is what I'm told it looks like. I got this off the internet because I haven't been to this spot. It's not real easy to get to. It's not right by a road. So they were there, and then the job was to go south, straight south, and a longitude line. And in order to do that, you got to get into some astronomy and some tables that have to do with celestial things. This is because for longitude, you're going around the globe a certain distance from where the 0 point has been established in Greenwich, England. And so it's a 24-hour circle, and you need to know where on that circle, that great circle, you are with a good timekeeping clock. And that was a big challenge for these people in those days. And so that partially explains why something like this could happen. So Houghton and Ives had established this as the corner at Oregon. Then this guy, Major, was hired by the government, and in 1868, he was coming from the west along the 42-degree line, and he said it was here, and that was what von Schmidt was ordered to use. But von Schmidt now had the telegraph line and where the railroad was running across the state, and he could check time signals from using that from the city. And he determined that it was not there at all, and if he followed orders, he would be marking the wrong line. So this is von Schmidt's corner, and that's what he did, and he had trouble getting paid for a while because he had gone against orders. So as he comes straight down, eventually he's approaching the railroad tracks at Verdi, and he put a marker. There were 4 iron markers that would go in, and this particular one is interesting today because when you go to where it is, you kind of go, well, why didn't he put it here? Now he did put one right down where the railroad tracks intersected the boundary line, and later the railroad company took it out because it was in the way. This one, it turns out, back then or up till then, until the railroad came in, it was the most important road in that part of the Trans-Sierra crossings, not the road we know of today that goes over Donner Pass. And so anyway, he placed one there, and the markings on all of them are like this, where sort of like the other ones that were scribed on wood. One of them would say that how far from Oregon they were, 176 miles and some chains. One side would say Nevada, the other California. And then this side, I had to, it didn't show up well here, so I had to do this. I wanted you to see that in identifying himself, on this project, he always put astronomer and surveyor because of the need to calculate for longitude. Okay, so he put another one of these iron markers once he reached the shore of Lake Tahoe. It's right there by Crystal Bay on this point. It's on land that's owned by Cal Neva Casino. And it's not there anymore. I don't know where it is. I haven't figured that one out. Disappeared or something. Be great to find it. Anyway, so now they finished. That was fall. That was the first year, 1872. And then in 1873, they had this big job. First, they had to cross Tahoe and identify these various important points in order to get to that point, which would aim directly towards their ultimate goal at the Colorado River. They used a steamboat, they used fire signals, they used flag signals, and as you might expect, their line was not where Houghton and Ives' line was, coming off the lake. This is von Schmidt's. And these two we'll talk about. In 1890s, there were corrections made to some points here with better technology. And so anyway, this is where von Schmidt came out. He put a marker, a granite marker, right by the edge of the lake. And this photograph was taken of that marker by these people who did this later survey. And he also put a marker right by this road that was going off towards Carson City. And I'll tell you where that marker is today in just a moment. But first, there's this fun thing. One of the first entries after they start moving along the angled line was that they went through the window of Mr. Lapham's house. So I looked it up. Mr. Lapham's house wasn't just a little house. It was a roadhouse. And it went right through their restaurant, apparently. So that was kind of fun. A fun entry, I think. I think they probably liked that. But anyway, that granite marker that was by the Carson Road was in the way as development happened at South Lake Tahoe. And so it was ultimately moved outside of the museum in Genoa, which is not even in, it's in Nevada over the hill on the other side. So it's not, it would be appropriate for a museum if they interpreted it, explained it. There's no explanation at all. But I want to point out this is interesting. So the granite marker that he put at that location that now is over here was placed originally in 1863 by the Houghton Ives people. And von Schmidt saved some money. You see how this is dug out? So it's 10 years later, and it's 1873. Oh, okay, yes. So this is just one of the sources that's written about this, put together this nice graph to give you an idea of the ups and downs that they would be facing as they moved forward. The incredible heights of the White Mountains and the lowlands of the desert as they came south. So now I'm going to just show you some pictures using Google Earth. This is a modern picture. The line here is the modern boundary of California and Nevada. And this is coming down over the Sweetwaters. And von Schmidt's line came very close to where this one is. The corrected line and his line are just, they coincide right in this area, and then they cross each other. But anyway, this is the Three Sisters Peaks, and that middle peak is where the boundary line is. That picture's taken from the highway out there. When you get into the Mono Lake Basin, there's a couple of the markers that I was glad that I was able to go visit because of with the help of BLM surveyors. The mileage that's referred to on this one is 294 miles from Oregon along the line. So that bent line at this point would have been 294 miles. And there are some inscriptions on these posts again that tell the numbers of miles along with the Nevada, California, and AW's own name and all, and the year. Here's the next one, going farther south. And I'm looking south in this picture. I wish I'd taken the picture a little differently, but you see again how they've squared off the posts on four sides. And so if you get the angle right that's facing that way on that angle, that's the actual oblique line that he's following. And so this one is a little farther into the Mono Lake Basin. And here's a map that von Schmidt, a section of the map. Von Schmidt, in the archives, Bancroft and in the National Archives in Maryland, there are two sets of this map. This thing is gigantic. It's over 11 feet long in two sections and 20 inches wide. Okay, and it has all this great detail. So on this one, I was just showing you 294, 295, 296 is next. So this is that point. It's about where Highway 167 goes over the pass, right in there. And he drew in Aurora. Aurora was pretty much becoming a ghost town by this time. It was long past its prime. Bodie is not boomed yet. There's a little camp there, but Bodie wasn't like a place they could go have a beer after doing a day of surveying at this point. This is 1873. When did Bodie boom? 1878 through about 81, the big years. Okay. And then the detail here you may not see from there, but it says stage road from Aurora to Benton. And so Benton was a camp that's off the map here. And then here comes, you cross over, where the boundary is into Nevada, down near Benton, just up a little, up the highway a ways from it. Well, back then there was a stage road, started at Aurora, came around and came out into Nevada here towards the town of Columbus, which I had not heard of until then, as a little silver town. Yeah. And this is the kind of description that goes along with these. So he talks about, in this case, what mile he's describing and hitting that stage road. And here's the continuation of that page, and I just put it in because it does clarify what happened with the next marker. The next one to the south, there's no big rocks. They didn't excavate a big pit and fill it with rocks and do all that. They just stuck this pretty large post in the ground. And if you look around, you can see why. There's no rocks there. They had to use what they had to use, and not all of the markers are the same. Some are made with different kinds of wood. Yeah. So then, of course, from Benton and all, they would have had it looming in their face, the job they had to climb the White Mountains. So today's line runs, as you see it here on Google Earth, and I've identified where Boundary Peak and Montgomery Peak are. And this is what you see on the topo maps. Here's the modern line. Here's Boundary Peak off to the east and Montgomery Peak off in California. And here's the von Schmidt Line, 1873, still showing on the maps. And that correction was, again, I'll explain a little more about it in the 1890s. But Boundary Peak had been in California. And Nevada's pretty proud of Boundary Peak as this incredibly high peak and that survey made that change. Here's the Inyo National Forest map that shows the same relationship here. Those two lines, by the way, are not parallel. It's subtle, but they are not parallel lines. So of course then they had to face all that southern desert challenge. And this is before they even hit the last really worst part of the Mojave up near Death Valley. And I wanted to show you this. So I've set this up so it's not quite on the new line. The point that I wanted to show you is that about von Schmidt and working with the Native Americans. He describes in the journal some of the Indian encounters, and they're just informational, really. These people were, he said, living a really rough life at this point, 1873. But anyway, he put in here the Chungup Mountains. He used their name for these mountains in this case and translated it as mountains without water. And up here, these mountains that are just off the map, the No-Wahut, was translated as Yellow Pine Mountains. So he definitely was working with that. And I think this is fun, by the way. I'm going to back it up. Take a look at this topography and this topography. Okay, so we're here running up to here. Okay. So, come back. Got to get the lizards in. So the last 40 miles, there was one more last spring, and then the stretch that was totally dry that really had gotten those guys back in the early years. And what happened, this little spring, it's interesting to describe, you can imagine, would slowly, they would get some out of it, and then it would slowly fill while they waited. And then they'd get some more, and they had to fill their barrels for their mules full enough to cover the rest of the trip. So, and this was his description of that. They didn't see anything alive except these critters. So, and his interesting spelling of lizards and things. So he gets there, and they complete the survey. They were only a quarter mile off from Ives Point at this point. And Ives Point, now we're talking about the point that the survey had done in 1861. In this diagram, this is what the boundary of the river canyon, as when you're standing there, and here it is on the other side. And then there's the river, which would move back and forth and move, still does today. We're allowed between these banks. The problem for von Schmidt was that he was told to reach 35 degrees at the point where it intersects with the Colorado River. And this is where it used to, back over a decade earlier, 12 years earlier, this is where he found it. And so he telegrammed to his boss in Washington, and his boss in Washington, they could have said, well, actually, by 1890s, the instructions were just go for the middle of the channel. Okay, but von Schmidt's boss said, well, you got to go where the river is in that, this intersection, which means 1.5 miles of correction at this point had to be made all the way back. They would have had to do corrections, and they always knew that, but it would have been a much, much easier thing. And so by the next spring, he started, they gave him a heading to follow. So it's a new heading. He's in a different spot, and they from Washington, they gave him a calculated heading to follow. Well, next spring, as they started going, they got about a third of the way, and this is greatly exaggerated, by the way. But anyway, they should have been following a line that would never intersect their line, their old line. Instead, they ran into their markers, and that was not right, and that wasn't expected, and that was certainly unpleasant to contemplate having to correct that again. So von Schmidt basically sent in his reports and said, we're done. It wasn't really recognized that there was a bend. It's a very slight bend, actually, nowhere near as bendy as this is. You saw those other map drawings. But he didn't tell them. And in the 1890s, they found the problem. Because better technology said that the starting point was off and the point at Tahoe was off. And then as they surveyed, it took them, by the way, this next crew 6 years to do what von Schmidt did in 2. They found this problem. And so that's why we have that funny situation on the line. Von Schmidt's line is noted down at the Colorado River with a state marker and a Nevada marker and another one of these iron markers that he put in, which got toppled when the river moved, and a local rancher put it up, and it really isn't sitting, on the line. But this all is kind of explained in these history markers. So I want to just 4 more slides. I want to tell you a little bit about what else is in the book about the rest of his life. In 1875, so he finished this in 73, he was taken on a stagecoach, a Wells Fargo stagecoach out of Quincy, and a highway robber stepped out and said, give me the gold bullion box that Wells Fargo carried. And von Schmidt, there were like 7 or 8 people in this stage. He climbed out the backside and came around with his gun, big gun, they said, and the guy fled. And no shots were fired, but Wells Fargo, because he had saved the bullion and at the risk of his life, Lloyd Tevis signed this inscription inside this gold watch that one of his great-granddaughters still has today. So 1875 was not a good year for von Schmidt. His wife Fanny died pretty young. His youngest son Walter, who was a sea captain from the age of 17, was sailing some ships that year for his father, went up to Alaska and was lost at sea. So that wasn't good. Lily, his daughter, got married and had this granddaughter, Alexine, but her husband died young, and so she married Charles Tilden, who you may know that name if you know the Bay Area. East Bay Regional Park District was created and overseen by Mr. Tilden. They lived in Alameda. And then he had another son, Alfred, his second son, who ran a vineyard in Fresno and had mental health problems and ended up in an asylum. His late life, a lot of things didn't go well. Edward was the oldest son. Edward had been a sea captain for about 15 years. He'd sailed from the East Coast all the way to Hawaii, even to China. He sailed for Spreckles, the sugar people. He was an eccentric, and once he decided to settle in San Francisco in the 1880s and into the 1890s, he became the captain of this dredge that was von Schmidt's next big thing. The dredge was a suction dredge dredging out the channel to create Alameda in Oakland, off Oakland as an island, which it had been a peninsula. And the dredge was used in San Pedro. It was used in Australia. It was used in Washington, D.C., where the tidal basin is on the Potomac River. So that was what he was really involved with in his later life. Edward was captaining this dredge, and he was the head of a yacht club in San Francisco. But he had married a ballerina. They'd had 5 kids. And she divorced him, and he killed her and himself. These were the later years of this man who'd done so much. So he moved to Alameda from San Francisco, and he took care of his orphaned boys, the grandsons. His daughter, Lily, took care of the 15-year-old granddaughter. And picture was taken in 1900. In 1906, the year that the great earthquake that caused the great fire that destroyed almost all of San Francisco, he experienced that, and their family, the boys, came running in that morning in Alameda, said, Gramps, did you feel that? He said, well, it's worse than the one that they had about 30 years earlier. Anyway, he died within a month of that incident. He never did go back and see what San Francisco looked like. A lot of his papers were lost, and they were in fireproof boxes in his office in San Francisco, and fireproofing didn't work. This is his headstone, very simple. It says he's a pioneer, and it's up in the Oakland Cemetery. And because of the devastation, maybe we can think about like the Camp Fire in that smaller community. San Francisco was so devastated. His death was noted in the papers, but not much was done. I think it would have been very different in a different time. So I got into this too because I got interested in von Schmidt coming into the Mono Basin over the Sierra and what his reactions were. And I found a bigger story, and I haven't told you a lot, and that's what talks are supposed to do. They're not supposed to tell you the book. But if you want one of the books, we've got some here tonight. I'd like to thank SNARL again, and thank you all for coming. Do we want to do questions, or did I go too long?
We can have a couple of questions, and then maybe, David, if you'd like to talk to folks.
Go out front, yeah. Anything pressing? Connie.
Go for it. Dave, I loved it. I loved your book, and this gave lots more detail, so that was awesome. My question in reading this was, especially along the von Schmidt line, the area that I know so well, did he leave any detailed journal notes that we might reconstruct things like tree line, or what tree species or plants he was seeing? He's walking on that ground, and
He was required to do more description of the soil and of the plants when he was doing sections, because of and that wasn't very detailed. On the boundary line, he describes what they're seeing, but I don't think there's a lot of what you're after. He describes trees, and his names are sometimes a little different. Yeah. But I have them. I have copies of those journals. The neat thing is he did the basic thing where he describes step by step, and he had a descriptive journal, and that's the thing I found most useful.
Well, especially the angle going from Lake Tahoe down to Colorado. Did the states of Nevada and California work together in the legislatures? There's a lot of legal implications.
Right. So he's working for the federal government on that. And it wasn't all settled finally. These questions about the inaccuracies and the problems in both parts weren't really settled until a court case between California and Nevada was settled in the 1880s. 1980s, 100 years later, or more than 100 years later. Now, by that time, around Tahoe, if they had corrected his line coming from Oregon a little bit, 4 casinos would have ended up in California. Nowadays, maybe they could do that, but back then they couldn't. Anyway, the decision was made by the court to accept the vertical line as von Schmidt laid it out. And then the decision was made that it was really a significant enough difference all the way on the oblique line that they would go with the 1890s survey. And yet it's intriguing, and I don't have a good answer, but I just feel it's a sort of a recognition of how long it had been on the maps and how important the surveyor was at what he did, that his line is still out there on the maps. It still hasn't been removed from all the maps.
There's always boundaries, how they were established, you know.
Well, this thing about, in the case of California, I mean, there's a neat book about how the states got their shapes. But in the case of California, as I said, it's 42. It's not 42.78, it's 42. And here's this line, 120 and 39 and 35. And it all sounded so easy. Maybe one more, and then I should go out front.
How much of von Schmidt's line did you explore or walk?
Not that much. I know I personally have been to 3 of the markers, not too far from where I live. I know a former fish and game biologist who's now gotten excited after reading my book about finding some of the others, and he's found some up in just north of Benton. I know, and a friend. Botanist friend sent me a picture of a marker she came across up on the Sweetwater Road, where it crosses the highway up there, somewhere up in there. I don't know exactly where. I know she didn't read the marker, but it's easy enough to go to the records that BLM Government Land Office holds and figure out details about each of those and what he said about them when they placed them. Shall I go out there, and anybody who would like can come visit me at the table? Thank you. I'll just,